Going live. Okay. So welcome to Graduate Thesis Midterms at SCI-Arc. So I'm Marcelyn Gao, and as Florencia introduced, Florencia is the Graduate Thesis Coordinator, and I'm one of the Graduate Thesis Advisors. So you'll be seeing 3 students from my group and 6 students from Florencia's group. And I just thought it would be nice if we go around all of our guests and just tell us a little bit about yourself before we begin. So maybe, Elisa, would you like to begin?
Oh, sure, certainly. So thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to everybody's work. And I love mid-reviews because it's just this constructive conversation. It's, you know, not at the end. So there's all the possibilities still for incorporating, you know, criticism or critiques, constructive criticisms. So I am established in Caracas, Venezuela. My practice is called Enlace Arquitectura. And we work, a significant part of what we work on, or the kind of the environment, are informal settlements, or barrios as they're called in Caracas. And also rural landscapes in Mexico associated with the production of mezcal in the area of Oaxaca. That's been a big driver recently. I teach currently at Princeton and also at the University of Toronto. Yeah, looking forward to this.
Thank you. Thank you. And maybe Mimi, would you like to say a few words?
Sure. Hi, I'm Mimi Zeiger. I teach at SCI-Arc. I'm a visiting faculty in history theory. And yeah, no, it's great to join you guys. I think I saw some of these works at maybe a quarter point. So I'm looking forward to checking back in on them.
Great, thank you. And Javier, would you like to say a few words?
Sure, if you want, let me try to get my camera phone on so you can actually see my face while I introduce myself. If you want, someone else can go first, and then I can speak about myself.
This is a very private review, so we have 3 guests. It's a focused conversation because everything you say will affect their final review presentation. So.
Okay. So I'm Javier. I'm from Mexico City. I work at Infonavit. Right now we're dealing with a huge reconstruction project in Jojutla. We're about to start 55 houses. We're also working on rebuilding houses in Tijuana and starting a big auto construction project throughout the country. We're working in the sierras in Nayarit to try to get water and light and sewage in order. There's a bunch of projects that sort of transcend the architecture realm and focus more on public policy.
Thank you. So this, I think we're going to have a very productive conversation. It's fascinating, everyone's work, very diverse range of work that you're all doing. So we're going to start with Reza Salehi. Reza, would you like to share the screen?
Yes, just give me. Okay, is that shared?
Yes.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Reza, and project. Every year in more than 20 million people participate in a page that's name is Arbain. And these people every year participate this pilgrimage together, and this thesis is trying to enrich this pilgrimage with transferring the job pilgrimage through the architectural plan. Here, there are some pictures, some photos from this pilgrimage. and my thesis. Relationship between individual and the aggregation of people is like the role of bits in a digital system. And this relationship will apply as a principle in this project. The potential of aggregation to create larger forms according to a discrete logic is the main idea of my thesis. There are three precedents in my thesis: Isfahan Bazar, calligraphy, and card. Isfahan Bazar is aggregation of buildings with different forms that make larger forms. That here is the root of Bazar and is making connection between two parts of Isfahan. Every forms has their own identity, and with connecting to other forms make another larger forms. Islamic calligraphy is the second precedent. I try to use one kind of Islamic calligraphy and make new languages with that. Using the calligraphy architectural material, like its historical role in Islamic architecture, is the way that we want to use calligraphic forms. As you can see in this photo, in Islamic architecture, in the history, we have some forms that they use the calligraphic forms, but they are not just decorative forms. They play a tectonic role, and we are trying to use calligraphy in a tectonic way. And the third precedent is Caravanserai. Caravanserai as a platform that in the history used as a platform that people and traveler could gather together and share their experiences in this space. In the first step, I used these calligraphic forms, and I try to make the new languages with curving them and with applying these forms and using the software tools with extrusion, Boolean, and other strategies. I made these forms. Based on the Isfahan Bazar, I try to connect these forms together to make a larger forms and have a quality like Caravanserai and like Isfahan Bazar quality. Here you can see the spaces that they are available in my forms, and here is the map that I have. This is a start point from Najaf, a city in the Iraq, and this is the end of the route in Karbala. The whole route is around 46 miles. I will make 3 of these forms and place them, sorry, 2 of them, and place them in point number 1 and number 2, something like this, as the main point that in these points there are some support center for pilgrims, and they will support them with different programs like healthcare, like there are kitchen healthcare, spaces for sleeping, and other programs that they are needed. And in point A, B, and C, we have a smaller form like these that again support the root. And in the rectangular points, we have some bridges that give the pilgrims a different point of view and give them a different experiences from the aggregation. These are the model that I made before, and these are the quality of shadows and everything. Here I made some collages that shows what will happen in the end with my forms and how people will use these forms. Spaces for mirroring and other activities, spaces for serving tea or other foods to people. These are some rendering. And at the end, in the next step, I will try to use some patterns again from history for lighting the forms. I will apply these forms on these glasses that I have to make a quality of shadows like these. This is my model for midterm. And yes.
Thank you, Reza.
You're welcome.
Thank you. So yeah, we can begin the conversation. We have
if you want, I can take a first stab at it. Hi, Reza, how are you?
Hi, good, how are you?
Good. I really like your project. In April, I had a trip planned to Uzbekistan to see like these buildings that you have on here, and it got obviously canceled. So this is very reminiscent of what my plans used to be. I think it's very interesting. I think sort of the idea of having sort of like a big passageway that goes from town to town is super interesting. It has a lot of potential. I can imagine that there are like specific problems that arise in each city. I don't know if there's like, where do people sleep? Do they get dehydrated along the way? Do they need to be fed at specific times? What happens to those people? So I think the buildings will become more interesting and more appropriate as, I mean, in the measure that they sort of like respond to existing problems. So I think that would be sort of like my largest comment.
Thank you. Actually, I try to apply programs to these forms. So before starting this step, I need to make a timeline sheet for everyone that, for example, for a pilgrims, that in what time of day what he or she needs, and based on that I will apply the program to these forms. So in these forms we can give the services that pilgrims need during the route.
Yeah, and also try to think about scale, because in these sort of like, I don't know how budget deprived these towns are, but perhaps each of these forms can sleep 2 people, and they're not necessarily entire hospitals.
I actually, in my mind, I was thinking to making bigger than this. So this form will be bigger than this you said, more than 2 people. As you can see in these collages.
No, I can see the scale.
Uh-huh.
I mean, it would be interesting to see the form fit the function and the budget.
Mm-hmm.
I can go ahead. So Reza, thank you. This is, I think, you know, a very challenging proposition that you've made for yourself. And you've begun by looking at precedents that are, for example, the calligraphy one, not even precisely an architectural one. And I think now your task would be to gain detailed information on actual things that are demanded of both the ritual of doing the pilgrimage, as Javier mentioned, you know, things that the people need, things about the landscape that are pre-existing. Topography, we don't really have a sense of that, or plots and properties that are along the way. So in this image, for example, if that's an actual image of where you're planning on putting it, all of those different patterns on the landscape are indicating different ownerships. They're revealing, you know, uses that might vary from some agriculture to just empty lots. I don't know, because I'm not familiar with this area, but you would be, I think, surprised to find that indeed this, you know, that, for example, this implementation on the site that you've proposed is actually on, I don't know, 40 lots. And the richness of that, I think, is something that you can actually bring into your project. I'm not saying it as, you know, something to make it less valid, but to make it richer. So the probability of this looking as homogeneous as you've proposed it is unlikely, because it is very possible that the idea of producing this kind of infrastructure to help and to accompany people, and not just help and company, but take advantage of the fact that, you know, this is a market, like they need to buy things and they need a place to stay. So I think you need to look at existing infrastructure for other precedents of this sort, like the Santiago de Compostela route in the northern part of Spain. Historically, Delphi, which people went to for the oracle, has all sorts of little shops and things. And in the case of Delphi, they congregate in a long sequence prior to the oracle. They are not sort of spread out intermittently on a route. They're very concentrated, and they become more dense as you get closer. The ones on the Santiago de Compostela route have different lengths. 46 miles, I'm sure, is definitely comprised in some of those routes. And like, how frequently do they have infrastructure? You know, if people are walking, what's the distance that one walks in one day, and where you would need these to occur? So that, I think, will bring you back into you know, some sort of realistic sphere to be more precise about the scale. I don't think you can ignore the property lines that you might speculate exists, and I don't know if you're going to find a map that it precisely gives them, but those images, satellite images, reveal a great deal. Like if I am owner of the same land, I'm not going to subdivide it into different things that are going to appear differently. I'll probably just be the one owner. And how they're made, like who is the agent behind any of those kiosks or buildings. They will be run by somebody, they will be built by somebody. And that's why I don't think they're going to end up looking as homogeneous as you've proposed them. There might be a basic unit in the same metaphor as language, a basic bar or a basic element that then gets transformed and augmented and enhanced by that person or family that manages that little inn or business or whatever it might be, or care center. And then there's one other thing that I wanted to mention about all of this. Oh, yes. 22 million people. Okay, so what does 22 million people mean? Are they all going at precisely the same time? If that is so, then this infrastructure is a temporary thing. It doesn't make sense for once a year to have all of this permanently. It'll deteriorate. It won't make any sense. You have, for example, Burning Man, which is a temporary city in the middle of Nevada somewhere. And how it organizes itself is very interesting as a precedent that you could look at if it is temporary. If it is permanent, more like in the Santiago Compostela way, like how do these 22 million people trickle themselves through the year? What's the amount of people that you're trying, that represent a client or represent somebody to serve along this route?
Okay. Actually, I need to mention just one thing here. It's something between permanent and contemporary, because during the specific time that it's called Arba'in, these huge population participate in this pilgrimage. But in the other times during the year, other pilgrims use this route and use actually the shrine and other holy places for mourning and other.
Well, that's very interesting. You're going to have to come up with something that can expand and shrink depending on the demand. And I think the part that is also important is to understand that this is going to form over time. Like you will not have, the structure as you're presenting it there and then in one moment. And so how does this formation, accrue and organically come to exist is something that you might want to give faith that you've understood that by presenting different scenarios, depending on different forces.
Okay. Yeah.
I think these comments are extremely helpful because I think the just now that we're seeing, that's the timer. Now that we're seeing the first time that you're looking at this on the satellite map, and as Elisa just pointed out, that the ownership and the lots and the different ways in which they're used, some of them might have animals grazing on them, others might be agriculturally active. And so could this be like a temporary, almost like pop-up pieces of infrastructure that are made of quite maybe lightweight and inexpensive materials that then could cater to the way in which those plots of land are being used throughout the year? And then maybe the assembly, because they're kind of modular in a sense, maybe they clip to each other in a very simple way. And maybe the things that look right now that, where you show those mullions, we don't know yet what that material is, but that could even be some thin like scrim that gets stretched over a scaffolding structure. And, so parts of it might be very temporary and movable. And we've talked about that possibility as well, that these can reconfigure.
Yeah, I think scale is going to be incredibly important here. And also sort of a gesture towards materiality, and that for me that doesn't mean drawing mullions which look like an office park, because those are ecologically inefficient, right? Like you'd be creating a glass box which would be heating up in the desert. But I want to kind of take the comments around sort of scale and function and materiality back to some of your original sort of investigations around sort of the idea of calligraphy and form making, because I think that they're interconnected, because there is this idea of something that is surface, something that is a kind of three-dimensional form, and then something that is in between, which is relief, right? And I think you're actually really quite more interested in the relief more than actually even sort of questions of patterning. And with that, I think that could suggest that the difference between something that is shallow, right? So it could be a shallow imprint on the landscape that sets up the kind of relationships that would happen later with something more temporary that goes on top of it, which could be surface, right? The idea that Marcelyn is suggesting that something could be stretched over a form. So as you're sort of thinking through the conceptual ideas, understand that they actually have implications as you start to make this thing, right? So this could be a series of sort of low concrete type works that are services that are embedded in the site, and then the kind of temporary language of how it's occupied is a series of these more lightweight patterned sort of festival tents that kind of come on top of it.
Thank you, everyone. I hate to
so much.
have the conversations, but we're over time and we have to move to the next project. So thanks.
Thank you, all of you.
And so our next project will be Sixtina Maculan.
Hi, everyone. I'm working on a memory that's no longer mine. And in the chat, you'll find a link to my animation. And if maybe Marcelyn, you can let me know when you're back, so I will continue talking about it a little bit more.
Okay, so if everyone can, also everyone's muted so that we don't hear the sound echoing, that's great. Everyone can watch starting now. Did everyone finish?
Okay, so memories are often staged through sets of data which are often incomplete. Human memories are physical, spatial, and temporal, whereas this is fluid data. The dynamics that occur between the engagement, the human memory, and the machine memory expresses themselves through factors of resolution.
Your audio is breaking up a little bit.
Oh,
Maybe you can just say that again. Sorry.
okay. So the dynamics that occur between the human memory and the machine memory show themselves in different layers of resolution. And the pixel sees that the space as they feel themselves in the
Sixtina?
Yes? Is it not working?
It's breaking up. Is everybody having trouble hearing?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh no.
Stay closer to the mic. It seems like when you get further away, it cuts out a little bit.
Okay, I'll come closer.
Part of the reason that I have two Sixtinas, and sometimes I've known of others who have two connections, the vibrations between them produce interference.
Okay.
Just offering a plausible.
Okay, I'll just try one more time to say. So making images can perform as a way of archiving memories. And this project has documented, manipulated, and regenerated an architectural memory. And now the camera narrates the spatial relationships in the transformed memory. I will loop the animation now again in the background.
So Sixtina, did you want us to begin the discussion?
Yes, please.
Sixtina, I seem to remember from when we saw this project last that there was a really interesting dialogue that came out of that conversation around what does a machine see, what does a human see, and I'm not hearing in your presentation a kind of theory of that. If maybe you can speak a little bit more to that question and how that plays out in certain instances in your video.
Yeah, so the human memory is spatial and physical and temporal, and but it's also blurry. We don't ever remember a place 100% as it actually is, and this blurriness is how I came to use the pixelation. That is also a representation of how the machine works, so that it's all based on data and it's very accurate. And the idea to have like this very high resolution objects versus the pixelated backgrounds that should articulate this relationship.
And in terms of the spatiality, do you want to talk about that, the difference in space?
So the difference, do you mean from the animation itself, or?
Well, where I think we're looking at one specific moment where it's the difference between pixelation and resolution. But then there's representations of space that you're trying to show us as well. And do those also sort of make the same kind of parallel?
Yes, so the space now is narrated by the camera, and the way how each scene goes to the next is sort of a threshold into the next scene, into the next room. So the animation is basically, or almost a design of a new house. And like with humans, like when you walk from one room to the next, you're more likely to forget something, like when you wanted to get something from another room, and while you're going through that, you might forget it. So in the animation, you see some objects that relate in other scenes again.
Okay, I just have a question. Mimi, that was very helpful. Thank you for those questions. The end result of this, like, where do you imagine yourself going with your work, just to be constructive in that pursuit?
Well, I think that the way how I was working can be a way of analyzing an architectural space. And so because the place that I chose is a house that actually exists, and I first started documenting that space, and then I used AI to manipulate the space, and then I made an architectural reflection, which then became this animation. So I think on one hand, it's a process that I discovered of working, but I think that this process could be implemented on other architectural projects.
Okay, that's great. Well, this would be my suggestion to you, is to make all of that very transparent. So for example, I would have loved, maybe this is one of the artifacts of your project, is the video, which is in and of itself for you a way of producing spatial variations or to capture through a different tool what time, incorporating the element of time, which other, resources and media that we typically use don't acknowledge, right? But I would have, like, I don't know, like a line that says, operation 1 is configuring that initial, or taking that initial piece of architecture, and operation number 2 is diluting it through the simulated dream process, and then number 3 is, whatever the steps are. But I think at some point your step needs to be to bring it back into drawing and show what that process actually produced, and for us to be able to, within our conventional means, assess, appreciate, sort of grasp, be able to compare that to, the lexicon of design that we already have in our baggages, and have a conversation about that. But I think you have other resources that you're bringing in too, which is the narrative that you designed and layered into the video, which doesn't seem to syncopate with this idea of the dream, or what the machine sees, the blurriness, all this that you clarified after Mimi asked you a question. So I think that would be my best sort of advice for you, is to be very forthcoming with all of the various inputs that you are bringing into this, in the hopes that it will produce, new ways of understanding space, or perhaps, a more authentic connection between memories production of space and, that we understand more conventionally. But some clarity would be, really appreciated. But.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it goes back to this question of, like, what do we consider with a project like this, the thesis? And I would, echo Elisa in saying, like, this is one artifact of your thesis, and you need some supporting documentation, research, other pieces that begin your statement. I think we talked previously that your statement was within the kind of poetic of this piece, and actually needs to zoom out to sort of really sort of tap, so I think you're bringing up an interesting question about sort of machine vision. And so I would like, I'd like for that to actually be the question, not us trying to parse what are we trying to get out of this video. I think there's some beautiful moments. The animation is doing some cool things, but I think we're struggling just to sort of figure out what does it mean? Like, why are we watching this? And if you premise all of this, or preface all of this with a kind of this, my study is in this relationship of machine vision to human vision with different kinds of dreamscapes, and I'm using the kind of the mechanisms of the computer representation to do this, then we begin to kind of come along with you on this video, and it opens up in ways that it can't when we're just sort of taking it in as a kind of aesthetic wash.
Okay. Yeah, that's great to hear, because I was considering like if it is enough to just show the animation as the thesis,
No.
or because I have all the other research, and so I just decided not to show it today to see.
I think also speaking about what's actually occurring in the scenes, and I mean, I'm really struck by the way in which, especially in the scene where the sheet of pixels, and we think we're looking at, you know, an image, and if we zoom into an image, conventionally we find these pixels, and there's a certain stability there and a certain logic to reading that image, but then suddenly that becomes an object, it becomes this draped form. And so it kind of breaks out of mimicking or representing an image, and suddenly it slips into being an object. And I think there are a few moments where this is occurring. And so I think it would be really helpful, as is being suggested by Mimi and Elisa, to actually be able to really speak about that. And I mean, maybe the preface, because we've been discussing this, is like, how much do you need to say outside of that narrative? But I think this is a clear indication that you do need to add some of that information and really tell us how you're operating on image and object, and what it means when you talk about machine memory, that means like really processing images with convolutional neural networks, or the AI is being trained on images, so it's a different kind of memory. So there might be some background that needs to be given. I also think that Elisa's suggestion about some drawing, I mean, I wonder, at one point I thought what's provocative as well is that in a sense, you're building a house in a way. I mean, you started with a house and now there's this new house. And so I wonder if there could just be a very simple drawing of like, what would the plan of this house, or this house in relation to this site? Like right now we're looking at the forest. But the forest has parquet flooring. So there are all these cues that are kind of being mixed between interiors and exteriors. So I don't know, that might be something to consider, is like what kind of drawing could communicate that?
Maybe some like kind of like a taxonomy of methods, or, you know, the steps as a drawing or diagrams that are sort of taking you through, like, you know, because there's clearly different techniques being used in each of these sections. So yeah, what's the difference between high res and pixel? What's the difference between something that is shown in 3 dimensions and something that's shown flat? Like, I think you have different moments that occur throughout the video, but like if you could pause on them and then give us it annotated, like that also is sort of building a toolkit of how this kind of house might get built, right? Like, so it's not just this house, but this is a way that other houses might, and sort of memory palaces may begin to be constructed.
Do you think that the source material should ever be shown? Because there is, as Sixtina said, there's a whole a board with all of the images from this house, the original images, and then the processed images. And then she used those to model each scene. Do you think those should be shown ever?
I think that would be fascinating. It's perhaps just a matter of how you choreograph the presentation, like what comes first. Do you say, oh, I have these inputs, and then, or do you just, you know, show the this moment that asks your audience, well, what is this? Or how do I take this in? Because it's a new input. It's, you know, not abiding by, you're just shaking things up to ask, like, what does this mean? You know? And then I think you would go into, okay, well, this meant for me, first of all, the choreographing of a process, which was this process, and it had these inputs. And then you could also say, well, but I would like to speculate on what this means. And I've produced these other things post artifact that I would, you know, as not myself having been the author of this, but as somebody else, speculate on what this is, you know, what this is offering as a new meaning, as a new reading, as an old reading, you know, as a rehashed meaning. I'm not sure, but I think it could be, I mean, I think it would be very interesting. I just, maybe how you time it when you're, you know, presenting it to your audience could motivate, you know, their own opportunity to speculate on it. And then you offer one to begin a conversation.
Thank you.
That sounds great.
I
Thank
think,
you very much. It was really helpful.
okay, thanks, Sixtina. We'll have to move on now to the next project. So our next project will be Wesley Evans.
Hi. I'm going to show a video which, pardon me, it might not be fully optimized for Zoom. I'm still kind of getting the hang of it. I'm going to talk over the video as we watch it on screen share. And but hopefully, if you notice it's coming through at a poor quality, there's actually stills at the end that we can look at in case that's the issue. So, does everyone see just a single video window? Great.
Yes. We see the player bar.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. So my thesis is titled No Rise on Collective Counterproductivity. At the scale of a city, or perhaps even much larger, the project investigates the formal implications of a kind of collective inhabitation set in a disastrous and very near future. These relentlessly patterned masses contain an extensive and textured interior. Here inside, we find ourselves engaged in numerous bodily arrangements, but most critical, we always find ourselves at rest. The project assumes a speculative post-labor economy sustained by a vast and automated workforce comprised of logistical networks which permeate throughout the architecture. The interiors support all forms of healthy and creative life. The fleshy surfaces and textured shadows produce figure-figure relationships. These are multiplications of the body which allow us to stand out and blend in all at once. The project is absorbent, organized by a sponge-like matrix of tunnels and aqueducts. These pseudo-modular volumes work like active water towers, able to regulate, mitigate, and reconcile all adjacent water tables through a system of locks, pumps, evaporation pools, and transmission far and wide. As the water drips slowly, time passes, and the material of this world is revealed to be diverse, but also substantially interdependent. Adjacencies of light and color pair one-to-one with architectural edges. This counter-urban project, organized around flows of resources and non-human infrastructural networks, the project is actively opposing urban conventions of transportation logic and developmental density. In other words, there are no roads and no downtown. Here, the bodies are freed from their relationships to the spaces which contain them. These interiors are designed to be unprogrammable by virtue of two facts. Firstly, by the homogeneity of function. The automated infrastructure and modular forms make all spaces equally suited for all activities. And lastly, by the heterogeneity of the bodies. Set against these low contrast surrounds, the bodies are the only mappable part of the architecture. In other words, the difference between here and there is identified only by the difference between me and you. The project is set in direct opposition as a kind of antidote to the capitalist model of the luxury megacity, rendered in forthcoming projects in Saudi Arabia like Neom, and foreshadowed in any major metro area found in the world today, like Tokyo or London, to name a few. The hope, of course, is that this will kill that. Again, the interiors are predicated on a kind of fullness. They are ripe with encounters. And these spaces, however, are only the fraction of the total volume, as provided by the network of channels. The rest, and most of it, is the infrastructure around. And here is a final image to leave on. And then
the resolution is a little bit low, so would you like to share a link so
yeah.
they can just see?
Well, what I'm going to do is actually just do this, and then,
because I know this is super high resolution normally, so
yeah.
yeah.
Can you see this?
Yeah.
So these are all the slides from the video. And that's it.
Wesley, I just have a couple questions. Like, are there any givens that you're working off of? Like, I mean, it's not many things as you mentioned it, but what would you say is a factual base that has been considered in this design? So, like, you know, I don't know, an area or number of people or
sure.
time or.
I think that let's say that's a hard question to answer, but I understand what you're asking. I've kind of, depending on the various parts of the project, there are different givens that are sort of taken as sort of foundational to how I'm making the project. And I wouldn't at least now suggest that they're all cohesive, but certainly on this larger scale, I'm thinking about coastal regions, particularly ones that are like high flood risk areas, and that these are perhaps set up as like essentially not quite land reclamation sites, but sort of stopgaps at these like high flood risk zones due to climate change. And then kind of at the micro scale back, like, or the sort of human body scale, I'm like kind of really trying to work, and this is like a totally different side of the project, really trying to work with the body as like the sort of unit of the whole project, where sort of all the entire color palette comes from these bodies. And of course, like the shapes, this sort of shape of the interior forms are also like, in many ways, drawn out of these images of human bodies in spaces, kind of as the starting matter.
Okay, then if your interest is the body, how did it become an operation at this scale, you know, at the scale of a very large metropolis?
I'm interested in trying to kind of bring those things together and see like what consistency could be brought through from these two very drastically different scales, which is why there's like kind of a variety of scales in the presentation as well. And I'm trying to build up a kind of language of moves that connects them all. I think it's probably the best way to answer that.
So Wesley, I think whenever you're presented with like a science fiction scenario, you sort of expect some rules to be given ahead, or you're in some time, or like there's some way these things get built and are preserved like this throughout time, so nothing ever grows old, and it seems like no one would ever grow old as well. Like it, I'm not sure if if the idea is just to look at it and then just contemplate the image, sort of like in a super studio kind of way, or you actually want to propose a reality, and then there would be like a lot of questions that arise. But I don't know if that's the intention at all. And what if your intention is to like deprive the human mind from, so like I'm trying to search for the word in English, but like of the many things that surround us and that have colors and that grow old and that differ your personality from mine, then perhaps the answer is not creating an entire new city in a coastal area, but just like turning everything white, like independent of where it is. And then you don't have to meddle with like the economic reality of humankind. I don't know if that makes sense.
Sure.
So, sort of like a real life example in Amman, in Jordania, there was this edict that all buildings should be white or cream color and 4 stories high. And that's the way everyone builds. Mm-hmm. So the reality is everybody builds whatever they want, but everything has to look sort of whitish and sort of the same size. Mm-hmm. And the topography does the rest. So you do feel like you're in a dreamlike, spaceless sort of place, but there is a very simple rule that governs everyone, right, independent of rich or poor.
Right.
So a few thoughts on this. I mean, I see this sort of like it within the kind of proposal of Super Studio or within like Exodus from Koolhaas. So I think it's with it. It needs to sort of respond to a political reality without necessarily responding to sight. And I think your framework for it, as said in your statement, begins to do that. And I do remember it being a little bit stronger in relationship to capital in your first statement. It could be that I just didn't hear it this time around. But in thinking about this relationship of the statement and how you read it to the work that we were seeing flow on screen, because I think that's the kind of the frisson of the thesis, a few things jumped out. One is the idea of flesh and the idea of diversity. And within that, I just want to note that the flesh that you are showing is pink, is white, right? And the diversity of bodies that you're showing are pretty homogeneous. And I think both in terms of skin color and in terms of sort of body type, there definitely needs to be a sort of a larger exploration about how do each of those things interpret leisure in a different way, whether that is cultural or whether that is aesthetic, but that needs to be represented because otherwise your text begins to undermine actually what you have made entirely. And so I think recognizing that what you've maybe wanted to sort of position as an anti-capitalist embrace of leisure within a set of sort of theoretical propositions that have architectural form comes off actually as a set of sort of privileged moves around leisure for the very class that you are trying to make a comment on. So as you start to sort of bring this into the kind of the race towards the end, like how do you quickly begin to enlarge your set of images, your set of subjects, and how do those subjectivities begin to impact what the aesthetic form takes?
Yeah, Mimi, that was very helpful. I too am, I guess from my own interest, taken by explorations that tried to counter, the form of production that we know of space, which is the capitalist one for sure. And the models of production of space that we know of that are different tend to be about shared space, communal land, different ideas of community, models that we still keep that were from pre-capitalist times, which tend to be, like the commons in England, for example. And I find it, compelling that you want to try to produce an investigation of this sort, starting from the body. And somehow that has led you to the assumption that the stage for that to be able to occur with some sort of clarity is one in which place is eliminated. And you mentioned that all spaces can be suitable for any action, and that there's this homogeneity of function. I think you might want to unpack what you mean by those terms more. I don't know if I completely buy or follow this equation that you've made between generating some form of spatial production from the body, and I would assume a body with a mind and all the implications that has, and that stage has to be of such strict homogeneity. And especially when it's an homogeneity that's replicated at this scale. It makes you come to the same conclusions that sort of, the Soviets produced as a, I don't know, misunderstood, I would say, idea about a Marxist production of space, which was to, bring everybody from the countryside into the city, into large, multifamily homogeneous structures. And that isn't that isn't a model that we celebrate as a different form of production of space. We nor the Soviets really celebrate it. You would want to come up with something, I think, well, because I'm seeing this in your tone, you want to find something that's kind of hopeful. I don't think you're producing this as a nihilist thesis, right?
No, I'm not. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm having a bit of a struggle in finding what is brilliantly hopeful in at least the imagery and this homogeneity that you're conflating with a different way of producing space. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
And so I find myself thinking about, like, within your presentation, I was like, well, what does the edge of this look like? And especially if you talked about the coast, it's like, well, there's definitely an edge at some point. And somehow, I don't know if we're programmed that way, like, but I'm looking at, well, where would the variation happen? Where would, and frankly, one possibility might be that you focus on something where you can have a more immediate relationship with the body and those spaces that you're exploring, without necessarily taking on the mega city scale, perhaps. Because I think what's interesting about these other ways of producing space is that it would imply that there could be a tremendous number of productions, different ways of producing space that would coexist.
Mm-hmm.
And so to produce this other way of space that's actually going to end up being ubiquitous seems to me somehow contradictory in its premise.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Wesley, I just dropped up into the chat an interview with Adrienne Marie Brown around her book, Pleasure Activism. And I think it might be interesting to you because it expands not necessarily on leisure, but on feeling good and how that can be actually a point of activism, and that how it's actually sort of, I think, rooted in Audre Lorde and the idea that self-care is resistance, right? You take care of yourself in order to take care of your others, and that is aligned with sort of a growing interest in mutual aid, especially as we're seeing around Black Lives Matter and sort of people dealing with the precarity of the current moment of this pandemic. So I feel like there's ways of deepening the arguments in this, and that as you do that, there is the aesthetics of the 12 square grid, the sort of urban block, will begin to give way a little bit. You'll be able to start to modulate sort of how much space is space that you need, and how do those sections begin to sort of suggest that certain things are bigger or smaller, right? Because right now it's a very kind of homogeneous definition. Sponge-like, I think, is really quite appropriate. But like, what happens, you know, if we're all home making sourdough, right? Sometimes you get those bigger bubbles in there, right? So what is sort of the production of those larger volumes, and how those might be produced, or sort of when and why they begin to disrupt the sort of larger sort of treatise of this kind of pink sponge world. Hopefully not all pink.
I think these comments are really quite productive, quite helpful. And even just the way in which we're seeing this today, which is a new format of where the images of the small collages of the bodies are presented on the black background, which then frames and kind of detaches them. It's sort of as if they're in a different world. And I always think when I see the images, the collages of the bodies, that they would be the very thing that would resist, there's this inherent tension between the relentless grid and then the bodies which really push against that. And I think this idea of self-care, because in a way, I wouldn't say that this is a project about leisure. I think you've used terms like post-productive space. I think was that the term, Wesley?
Counterproductive is probably yeah.
So the idea of where the body is no longer in service of labor, producing, and then what does that body do, and how does that relate maybe to soft forms of resistance that, there's definitely the suggestion of that here, but I think it's also very important both how you present it verbally, but also how the images are placed within the images of the relentless grid. Sorry about the noise. I think we have to move on because we've reached time. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And next, I believe we have the project by Rish Saito. Hi, Rish.
Hi, everybody. This is Rish. So what I mainly show you today is a 3 minutes animation. It's composed of 3 episodes, and I'm showing the first one today, and a little bit of the clues of the other 2. And there's some image and footage I wasn't able to add to the animation, so I will quickly show them later. Then the animation tells my work in progress statement, but I will put the Google Doc link on the chat just in case. Then also here is a YouTube link for my animation. if you are interested in high resolution version, but I'm gonna share my animation. This is also just backup. Okay, then let me set up for the playing the animation. Okay, then this is a still image. I quickly just share. This is a kind of my starting point of this project, the decomposition model. And then this is a miniature model. I try to interpret the decomposition into this model, and then some still image. Just quickly pass through. And then there is some simulation I couldn't add at this moment, and I just simply show. I'm thinking to use this script and then this coding for the second episode, which is renewal. Something like this. And then maybe I should show all of it. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Rish. So for our guest, a clarification is that those last 2 episodes, of course, they are work in progress towards final review in the movie.
Yes.
Rish, could you explain a bit more what you intend or what your understanding is of renewal, or how that manifests itself?
Yeah, so the first one is more like natural order of things. So it's inevitable, it's decaying and decompositing by maybe natural power or something. But human beings try to, resist that reality, right? That's why now still the human beings on this planet is surviving and developing. So I wanted to illustrate that reality. That's, the attempt of human beings, like, try to achieve, let's say, immortality or just healing by themselves. So the second episode is more like, I wanted to more design artificial, like, aesthetics rather than maybe the first one. It's more like organic, but still it's work in progress. And then third one, I want to tell it's entropy is still inevitable. So no matter how much you try to resist, you can't avoid it. So it's kind of, again, it's entropy. It's first it's entropy, and then going forward, and then going backward on the second part, and then third part going forward again. But yeah, still also I'm trying to how to illustrate. At least it shouldn't be the same as the first episode. It should be slightly different, but it shouldn't be totally different. So I'm not sure if I can explain right, but do you understand?
So your point of departure, though, for the renewal, if I'm interpreting correctly, the point of departure is that which has decayed most, or that which is. So I'm interpreting these holes in the wall as an
I think
error,
renewal was what maybe, but not proper word. I think it's more like resistance or sort of thing.
Resistance, okay.
I don't know. Yeah, still wording is really tough. So still that subtitle is also work in progress.
Rish, I'm still confused about the second episode. So the first one is pretty clear that everything's sort of decaying, but then in the second one, sort of these olives grow and things. Is this a different kind of decay, or is it sort of like an interpretation of things becoming clean again?
It's not decaying. It's more like counter entropy, trying like kind of more healing or repairing. It's going backward.
So reverting the decay.
Yeah.
So I'm not completely convinced that is like that. What's happening is in my mind going to countering decay. Or entropy, because it still feels pretty chaotic. However, I do think like the exercise is very interesting in sort of ways to come to terms with decaying. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Martin Roth or Adrián Villarrojas or these artists that like purposely leave things like for months in the galleries. So grass grows, and so like if you go the first day versus going the last day of the exhibition, it's like going into a completely different universe because like nature took over it.
Yeah, I'm up to that end. I'm also sort of thinking about David Leatherbarrow and Musa Musafi's on weathering, right? Like how do buildings actually decay, and how that's been depicted. But it seems like you have an interest in the kind of the mold, or the way that something is taken apart by something else. So I guess my question then becomes like a little bit back to like Sixtina's project. Like, is this a thesis that is about architecture in the kind of real world, or is this a question about a kind of modes of operating within digital landscapes?
It's like what I wanted to try. It's not like digital or physical. It's more like proposal of transformation of like architectural aesthetics, like new mainstream or something like that. So it shouldn't. It's not like about digital or physical, I think.
So if I'm going to say something like really like in a really dumb way, like this is you're countering kind of conventional architectures that we know that are kind of almost non-architecture, that have decayed, with a kind of aestheticized slime mold that makes repair. Is that right?
Can you paraphrase again?
So you're saying that conventional architecture as we know it has succumbed to decay. In fact, it's not even architecture, it's just kind of everyday buildings have worn and have created holes in them, and that those are opportunities for this kind of mold aesthetic to take root, right? So is this an aesthetic project? Is this like a new architectural language, or is this a systemic project? Right, like these are, and the word renewal to me suggests systems, right? Like this is a system for how we might restore something that has happened. But I'm not 100% sure, like really what it is that you're asking in the thesis.
It's more like aesthetics thesis, because now the architecture is permanent, right? And then if something is decay or ruin, no, there's a hole, maybe they just try to conceal it, or there's another mainstream like preserving like ruin or historical building. But this project, it doesn't take both sides. It's more like appreciating the end. So I'm seeing the end of life is beautiful in architecture. We don't need to overly protect it, or even it's not preserving, it's just let it go, and then let's see the beauty of the end. And then this project is trying to emphasize that beauty by designing decay, like aesthetics of decay, or aesthetics or of decomposition or decadence, or something like that.
Okay, I'm gonna botch a Japanese word right now, but is it sort of like the architectural equivalent of like kintsugi, right? The way that
yeah. Also, yeah, kind of I'm inspired by that aesthetic. So totally, it's not 100% related to, but also kintsugi, that wabi-sabi, the notion of wabi-sabi or kintsugi is like more imperfection, and then there's a clock, and then you're gonna fix with the gold, right? But it's like crack is kind of exaggerated. And then you see the crack, and then you see the life ends through that. Yeah, so it's pretty, kind of similar aesthetics, maybe behind. Yeah.
Okay.
Rish, so I have to admit this is challenging for me, but I do want to be helpful if I can. I think you have still a little bit more to unpack in the way you're understanding decay as a point of departure to then understand this other counter process. Or you're showing in your kind of petri dishes, or I'm going to call them that just to give it a science related name, but your jars, a mixture of organic things with, plastic elements. I'm not sure what all these materials you've chosen are, nor do I know the time period or what you mixed, or if you added acid, or if you, accelerated these processes in any way. But it would be, I think, worthwhile to understand the time, the, materials, and then perhaps to speculate on drawings, like say you did a cross section of those jars showing how it was at the beginning and how it might have ended up after this process produced decay, and in that metaphor going towards buildings, it might help to sort of document the way something may have been freshly constructed, and a drawing that reveals in which way that has been affected, either by subtraction or addition, because your model is actually showing a great deal of addition onto what was there through mold, through or simulated mold. But I think if you take it from this sphere that you're using right now, which are all objects or models or images, and take it back into something that you can contrast and compare to one another as objective as a slice or a plan, then when we come to this regenerative process, I think you would want to have a clear, more less azaroso, less what's the word in English?
Random.
Less random. Yeah, less arbitrary point of departure for your your resistance. So are you resisting from the weak point? Can you within your decay analysis find that there are weak points, or are you going to find the strongest points that resist that decay? And then in your point of departure for regeneration, have found something that makes the beginning have more sense than just, or is it, in a statue, is it like where water collects on the shoulders of that statue, or, something that you can document, and then speculate on what this material process, because ultimately I think since you're dealing in the decay with something that's very physical, I want to imagine that you're dealing with something very physical in this other sense too. Like, is this, organic, and there are cells that are dividing, and you can actually look to, scientific examples of these kinds of materials, like in skin that is, fake skin that has helped, cure terrible burns on people, or how in medicine, some of these regenerative materials actually operate, and then, I don't know, extract from that some sort of a logic that you can begin to base your proposal on. That is, I don't know, maybe then you again take that back into these drawings similar to the decay process and show how that would be operating. And another thing that I think is interesting in what you clarified afterwards is that the decay process doesn't just stop and you begin the reactive process. Like the decay is always going to continue to happen. And this other process is a layer onto it while the decay continues to advance. And so when this is introduced, you would see progressive slices of this registering both decay and, additions. And ultimately, maybe you don't come to some finite form, but you document, I don't know, 10 moments in this process, something that might just, foresee how this could continue. I don't know, just some thoughts.
We'll have to move now, but Rish, I just wanted to say one comment would be that I know those scenes are placeholders, maybe the part 2 and 3, but in part 3, right now, it seems to imply that we might return to a world that's quite familiar where you have that bar scene. And I would imagine, because I think some of the most powerful scenes are like in these images from 7 through 10, where there's a bit of a familiar world, and then this process of this entropic process starts to introduce these new qualities, new life forms. Maybe it's no longer about the human. And so I wonder, in the regeneration of the world, I would think it would look quite different. I wouldn't think we'd be really seeing, the bar on a New York City street at that point, but I don't know. It's just, I'm excited, looking forward to seeing what the final scenes how they will evolve.
Yes. I think that I think Rish, the conversation today it has very much that to do with. I think it's very clear that you have you have a vision of what you want to do. The imagery is fantastic, but you have to articulate it clearly. I think to Mimi's point, this is an aim at uncovering an aesthetics. And I do think that he doesn't want to stay only in decay and all the idea of, make some notes, the idea that you're just working on the notion of kind of the end of decay, which is kind of the disappearance of any features or any object, almost as if it becomes into pure nature. I Googled the stuff, Javier, that you mentioned. I mean, this is fantastic. I think, Rish, you should check on them. I put some stuff on the Google, but this is just Google. But that idea that things, that they are aiming at an aesthetic of materials that are not found, but materials that are grown. I think that's something that, Rish, you have to develop. I think in all of the stuff, things are coming out or things are kind of flowing. So I think that, I think that there's a few points. Yeah, I think here Mimi is adding more to the Villar Rojas in the right pronunciation. But I think that definitely Rish will need to articulate it. And to Elisa's point, maybe the jar process of showing ingredients is very specific about what he selected. That design process, I think it's also part of the presentation, Rish.
So thank you. Thanks, Rish.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
We're going to move now to Zepeng Gao.
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Zepeng. Let me share the screen. Okay, this one. And my thesis topic is a wrap. The wrap in the architecture, playing the role as the kind of the architectural design experiment. And the first thing I want to mention is the cognitive field. The Hans Holland once said everything is architecture, as we know. Each space has a cognitive field around it. For example, when you stand there, the cognitive field can be the sky and the ground. But when you sit on the chair, a bubble-shaped sphere space will form around you, which is your body's cognitive field. I start to visualize the cognitive field with the aluminum paper. You can see the cognitive field with different people there. And I make this block, and I will want to. This is my starting point. I want to start from to abstract something and select something from the block. The reason I want this is some element I choose from the block, and the reason I want to start from the food wrap because I see in the kitchen and finally no falling, no damage, and the possibility behind this material. And this precedent I turn to is the and it is the Andy Warhol's well factory, silver factory. Sorry. So I make some model like this and try to wrap all the thing in the block and find that the cognitive field there can be organized, and we can transfer and turn this block into some different space, like some higher space. And this is some abstract cognitive field I select from the block, and maybe you can turn it like this, and I wrap them, will becoming some space like this. And it is more similar to the, it is making the architecture in like a sign, more like the ways that it does in the Las Vegas. And the next step, I think I will focus more on the interior field between different space, because different cognitive field will affect each other. So maybe they will create some different shape. So this is some attempt I put into the side and to see how that's going. And yeah, that's it.
Zepeng, could you just elaborate a bit on how you went from, for example, image 26, which is, you know, we can identify very clearly what these objects are, to the, you know, image 37 with the amorphous kind of pancake levels?
Yeah, the layer there is that because I want to add some slab there. So after I put all the different cognitive field together, I will add some slab there. So they will be more something like that. But that is not the final render. I just, that is the page 37 is kind of like a placeholder for there, because I didn't make it. I didn't manage to make the digital model for now, but I'm trying to figure out later.
And what you said about the total designer now became the total selector, how does that continue to inform where you're going?
The total designer is that you can design the whole part, but the total selector that you can select some object and select some element from the side or some space, and you will find the relationship between each other, because the thickness of the object is there. So for example, a bowl, it can contain some water, but when it is contain some water, the function of the bowl will become the full container. But when it is not contain anything there, it is just a bowl. So the reason I want to use the total selector is that I want to make the thing has the function there, so they will become something else.
I think that my sense on that, Elisa and Zepeng, I think that the idea of the total selector has to do with the notion of the ready-made. You know, the fact that, you know, I think that goes to the Cristo example, that goes to this photograph. You know, what he's doing is he's choosing stuff. your question to the tower is that he wanted to develop the project as a tower. So he wanted to move from this block to a vertical block. I agree that it might be, we don't see that because somehow the tower went back to the slabs. It didn't look at all of the ingredients that were selected, let's say, for the neighborhood or this kind of block, which is the name of his thesis. His thesis is named block because he's going back and forth with the abstraction of a block to a city block, you know, like wrapping stuff can take you to, you know, kind of more abstract understanding of the objects that he found, the ready-made.
So, Zepeng, I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Judith Scott.
No.
So she's, I think it's my favorite art exhibition ever in the world. She's a woman with a very severe Down syndrome who was always kept sort of in institutions and had a very strong speech impediment. So we don't know anything about like what she thought or what she, if she understood the idea of art or she understood the idea of sickness or what she was doing, but she would only wrap things. And she would grab a random object and wrap it many, many times in many, many different things. And eventually she would leave it as a finished object. And sometimes you can see what's underneath and sometimes you can't see what's underneath. And we don't know if that was for her therapy or art or just spending time. But and also the word selector took me back to that sort of exhibition because you don't know why she chose that and why submit something to the process of wrapping it. So I think you should look into it because maybe, I mean, if that was to happen to a building or to a room or to an object in a city, like how you choose them and the purpose, like how does it get transformed when you wrap it many, many times?
Yeah, I would definitely check it out.
I mean, what's happening with the Confederate statues maybe could be an interesting example of what happens when you wrap them many, many times in many, many different colors.
Thank you.
Javier, thank you so much. I have been trying to remember Judith's name for like years. So that's brilliant for me. I was thinking of the same work. I was also sort of thinking about, like, I think you've changed operations from your first set of slides to the later ones where you begin to work on the level of the tower. Because I think there's something interesting here about that notion of wrapping and how something alternative is produced from that, right? The original is both obscured and new sort of formal consequences arise, right? Whether that's the space in between the wrapping and the original piece or the way that something may bulk up or like that the actual sort of limitations of whatever you're using to do the wrap. But as you move to the tower and then design what's being wrapped, I think that's where it kind of fails, right? Like I think you need to stay within the idea that you're, okay, I'm going to go out into the world and I'm going to wrap everything. I'm going to do Christo one better, right? Like I'm going to produce a system where, you know, you take the point of view that like we have enough buildings. In fact, buildings are failing us in many ways. And in order to sort of make these buildings better, whether that is aesthetically or functionally, they have to be wrapped, right? And so you begin to take things that are existing, right? What happens when you wrap City Hall or you wrap, you know, the Sears Tower, right? Like each of these, or even sort of wrap two buildings together and then you create a space in between, right? Like I think there's opportunities for you to sort of take the method that you've been developing and then sort of apply it in sort of like in a way of sort of a series of tests to see what does get developed as you sort of think about this idea of the wrap at the block scale. But rather than designing what you're wrapping, you actually sort of have to take whatever is there, right? And then work within that.
Thank you.
Just to add a couple of suggestions. One would be I quite agree that that this is sort of where you are in a promising moment, and the leap from here to the tower is either too quick or underdeveloped or not quite understood. And you want to, I mean, because this is pretty provocative, like this image, push this in its most promising direction, I think, and sometimes you might have had an idea that set this off, but in the process you came to something that you are also the author of and you can embrace, even if it takes you in a somewhat different direction. So, going also on what's been said and Florencia's point about the ready-mades is you, with this operation, can see very, because of its abstraction, the new readings that are produced by the void in between one thing and another. So you could imagine yourself just zooming in on certain moments and understanding the void of that as some other form that exists, that is, experienced in suburbia or wherever this is on a regular basis, but not objectified, and not, not presented as something in and of itself, because the way we read these spaces that are so quotidian is always through the positive object, and very difficult. We have a very difficult time reading it in the opposite way. I mean, so you could look at it as this exploration, thanks to the method of wrapping everything, that will provide a way of understanding these, voids and outside areas as some other form, again, that exists but hasn't been understood. And I'm actually thinking of, there was an exhibition at the, I'm not sure if it was still, it was at Met Breuer at that point, or if it was still the, it moved downtown. It's blanking on me right now. The Whitney. Sia Armajani, who made a dictionary of building, and he was documenting the most mundane things like steps in a door or a porch or window and desk, but in that sort of idea you could find like siding and fence, or light pole, and those are the actual objects, but what you document is some sort of realization of that space in a different way. And then where you go from that could be, I think, really a new way of packaging those together. I wouldn't want to speculate too much on that, but just milk more out of this moment that you've produced before you take your further steps would perhaps give you a more promising process.
Thank you all. Thank you all your comments. That's really inspired me a lot.
Thank you.
I put a Warhol Silver Factory in the chat, Zepeng, if you haven't seen that before, speaking of things wrapped with tinfoil.
Okay, thank you.
That was one question I had, because I think the slide you showed of the factory was like a model of the factory, or I don't think it was the actual.
It was I think an exhibit at the Warhol Museum. So they made selected visits. So it was, they were, I think,
I must have missed that when I went for a bio break. Okay, sorry about that.
Okay, thank you, Zepeng. And now we have.
Thank you, Zepeng. Slide 28, remember.
Amparito Martinez, thanks.
Hi, everybody. My name's Amparito. I'm going to share a link for a video, and you can click on it after when I indicate when to look at it. But here's the link. I'm going to share my screen. So before I start, I just want to give a brief sort of talk of what I think sound is. So sound could be understood as an architectural discourse because it can transcend into the field of acoustics in order to go into perceptual, narrative, emotional, and aesthetic dimensions. Sound has a strong connection to materials, textiles that reverberate off these materials and becomes a language of multiple conceptions of the realities, and begin to understand the different types of textiles that reverberate off these materials. The language of multiple conceptions of reality begin to determine the volume of these spaces. The study of sound is generally performed in control situations such as sound chambers. In this thesis, an empirical study of sound is an architectural design. The study of this thesis is in the tunnels located under the subway terminal building on Hill Street and 4th Street. Sort of the tunnels are a current version of arcades. So sound can apply various of things, but we're specifically looking at the attitudes and behaviors of sound and sort of the experimental genres. I like to call them manners. And there's 3 types of manners that I've sort of come up with. There's soft-mannered, ill-mannered, and strong-mannered. And what these mean are, for soft-mannered, are gentle ambient sounds that are not given to extreme emotions. Ill-mannered are sounds that are considered undesirable to the ear, disruptive, and interrupt the built environment sounds. And then strong-mannered are extreme loud sounds, elements that completely distort the sound perspective of the built environment. For the soft manners, I'm going to show I'm going to play an audio clip of each one. For soft-mannered, this is it. And you have ill-mannered. Strong-mannered. So downtown LA has a rich history of tunnels. The Pacific Electric Railroad Company was one of the few to develop a mass transit system in Southern California. And sort of they were the ones that developed streetcars, buses, and it was the largest electrical railway in the 1920s. And some of these terminals still lie underground in downtown LA. So in this map, this is the terminal building on Hill and 4th, and has been converted into Metro 417, sort of loft spaces. The terminal connects different tunnels throughout LA and so has been then closed. So there's the 4th Street Tunnel, Figueroa, Hill Street, and Spring. This is sort of the tunnel in the 1920s in sort of its most active times. And this is sort of what is now, and it's been closed since the 1950s. So its sound manners is sort of a study in arcades, and we're looking at the physical qualities now of these qualities. So for the sound manners can also be understood as sort of a physical quality, and I like to call these qualities silhouettes. There's the soft-mannered silhouettes, sort of a combination of loose fabrics and sort of plush cushions, fur, silk curtains, and braided rope. There's the ill-mannered silhouettes, a combination sort of tight fabrics, leather, latex, and rubber. And there's sort of the strong silhouettes, the combination of raw materials such as concrete, stone, and metal. This is sort of a study of these silhouettes. And for this arcade architectural design explores sort of the public programming materials and architectural soundscaping perspective. Sound puts us in touch with objects, spaces, and the built environment by synthesizing and understanding the sound type manners, the silhouettes, and the public sound. The built environment is relooked. So here now, if you can click on the link, and I'm going to play it on my screen as well, if you can't. Thank you.
Amparito, in the video, were you presenting synthesis of these three silhouette manners? Is what was being represented there exactly?
Yeah, in the video, you'll hear the sort of the three types of sound manners: the soft and the ill and the strong. Sort of the ambient sounds, sort of the built environment sounds, and sort of the slight disruption of the sounds. Sort of what is being depicted in these arcades, and sort of there will be more of these. So it's going to be a design of these series of arcades that depict all these types of silhouettes and manners, sound manners.
Oh, I have a dumb question. What's producing the sound?
Sort of the materials that are in
the materials don't make sound. The materials reflect sound. What's making the original sound?
Sort of the original sound is what you would hear in the built environment. Sort of it's just an exploration of what these sounds could be. You would also have the natural built environment, sort of what you would hear in these spaces.
Like?
Sort of like the terminal, and you would hear the people and the sort of the commotion that's happening in these terminals.
So footsteps, speech, motor sounds.
Right, and if someone walking through there, you hear them sort of touching the concrete, going through the curtains, sort of walking through the pillows.
Is it intended is it intended to be programmed? Like, do you have a program for this space?
The program, there is no program quite yet in there.
You have several things going on that seem to me to be happening in parallel, and I'm having a bit of trouble finding how or where you make them inform one another. Like you have a site, which are these tunnels, which I'm assuming cannot be visited, nor are they documented in detail. Is that correct?
There's very limited documentation of it, but they're there.
Okay, so it's a speculative kind of production of what that could be. So that's one. You have this point of departure, which are the sounds that you then classify at will into 3, but they could be 7 or 10 or could be many others from the environment, but there seems to be more to it than that. You kind of have a moral take on the propriety or the agency of those sounds, especially when you talk about the strong mannered sound. And then you have another one that's about, well, you call them silhouettes, but they seem to be about materials.
Yeah.
Which just kind of by chance, more than I think anything else, have the same 3 adjectives that you gave the sounds.
Mm-hmm.
Except that if I'm understanding from Mimi's question, those materials are instrumental in reverberating the corresponding sound that you recorded. So I don't know, the first one sounded to me like water flushing. So I don't see what that has to do with the soft materials. Anyhow, to me, they seem like 3 independent paths that I haven't yet understood exactly, how are they helping one another, or where are you hoping that this will go ultimately? Like, what do you imagine your thesis being ultimately about in the end, or where is this taking you? Because, for example, if it's environmental sounds, I would, and they are occurring within an urban environment, or if they're occurring in the tunnel, except that we can't really speculate to that extent because the tunnel is something that you cannot penetrate or live at present. But I'm not understanding how that has a spatial implication. Like, we're not documenting the reverberations or the the physical aspects of the space that are associated with either of those three sounds, or what their implication on space might be, which could be a very interesting point of departure. And then to that, you add the layer of materiality as something that, enters into resonance with it. So, like resonance works when you have two waves that overlap and coincide, and therefore you amplify the magnitude, or if they are canceling of one another. But that relationship, I'm not quite understanding. And maybe, so you have, the producing element, the reflecting material, but then you also have like the dimensions of that space, which if you're choosing the tunnel, what is a bit strange for me, but maybe that's just something you need to explore further, is that I'm imagining this to be a relentless, unidimensional section through and through. So is that because is that a choice because then you can really control this environment, and it's actually homogeneous in that section, and therefore all else remains, that's like a variable that you take out of it. I don't know, I'm speculating on many fronts, but just to go back to the first point, I don't really clearly see yet how they relate to one another.
Yeah, so the tunnels are sort of a way to control the environment and sort of the sounds that are being heard in these spaces, because they're underground, and so they're deep underground, and so you can't really hear anything that's going outside in the built environment. And so bringing the sounds of the built environment into these tunnels is sort of a way to understand what the perception of that space could be. And sort of in the materials are sort of a way to jump off of like what these sounds sound like based off what you're going through these series of arcades. So if you have an arcade full of, like this leather, the sound is going to be heard completely different. And if you go through a different arcade with carpet, the sound will be different. And so the sounds maybe should be more tailored towards what the built environment is, to be a little bit more clear. If that seems like maybe a more better direction of where to go.
But I think that to go back to Mimi's question also, it's like the sounds don't exist, you make them, like who makes the sounds. Mm-hmm. And to Elisa's point, maybe to connect all the dots, it has to be, maybe it's also, and to Mimi's point, it's like maybe you need to add that program that makes sound. What the train station makes a lot of sound. Mm-hmm. You get some of that stuff. So I wonder, she likes the tunnels as a site of control. Like, it's not like being in the outside, the sound will disappear, let's say. She can control that environment, but she needs a machine that makes sounds, either humans or, and then I totally agree, it's not about silhouettes, it's about materials. So I think you're always saying the sounds is sound, but I think that you need that machine that makes the sound. Mm-hmm. And that might come from a program.
Also,
or.
And Amparito?
Yeah.
So you've never been in this tunnel, right?
No.
So what we're hearing is not the tunnel.
No.
So why are you referencing? So you're saying that arcades have like this way of controlling the sound, but you're referencing this particular arcade, which we cannot visit and you haven't seen. And you're not sure it makes these sounds, right?
So it's more of a speculation of what this tunnel could be of these series of arcades, yeah.
But then wouldn't it be sort of like another approach, just since nobody can visit this site, would it be interesting for you to like speculate on how it sounds and then sort of like recreate a space by sound, taking apart like many different like particular elements that you can see in the pictures and then recording them elsewhere where they do sound, so that then you have like a collage that makes up a space that you cannot visit, but that could sound like that. And then you dissect the sounds however you like.
So, you're saying like a field recording of what this tunnel could be?
Or a collage of of recordings of things that that you would find in that tunnel, but that no longer but you don't know if they're still there, or that since are closed could be heard there, and then sort of like recreate the place by sound.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's an approach, but I mean, if you're so like, because it seems that you're leading to something when you talk about this arcade, but then I'm not sure how it connects.
What information do you have on the arcade? Are there any websites that document some of what happens there, or did,
or the tunnels?
Yeah, or people that have walked through them, like, I don't know, have written blogs about the bats that they see in there. What do you have?
Yeah, so for the tunnels, for the subway terminal building, it's closed, and the only thing that's there is it's just dirt, and then it floods occasionally. So you have the sewage and the piping system, and that's pretty much it. It's sort of an abandoned, if you think about it, it's an abandoned warehouse tunnel, and the only sound you hear are the sounds of what is left behind, which is really nothing. But back in its prime time, and it was sort of used for a public space, you would hear people.
Okay, so then that actually says something else. That is about kind of a history or an echo, or kind of the idea of memory coming back into a space. And if I want to think about this project on a whole as a kind of installation in the study of sound that has a speculative site, then the idea is to then reinsert sound in it. So you're going to have to program some sounds back into it in order to create the effects that you are trying to like get us to feel. So I dropped into the chat an exhibition that was at the Arc Des in Sweden recently called Weird Sensation Feels Good, which is all about ASMR, right? Which is about how people produce sound, and there's an argument within this exhibition that this is actually something that is designed, right? Like it is a spatial construct in trying to produce sort of feelings and sound. So you might want to take a look at that. But then also think about the work of Janet Cardiff and the kind of walks and sort of ambient sounds that she creates, right? So how are you producing effect is really at the end of this. And that's going to be through the idea of sound that you make, or sort of hauntings of sound, but also kind of through the different sort of formal arrangements of the materials that you're experimenting with in the digital space. But I'm really surprised to see that you're not experimenting with those in real space. I don't know, maybe you have like your bedroom is full of like silk and like rubber things that you're testing sounds against. But this is a real opportunity that I don't think is so hard, even under pandemic circumstances, to start to play with what do these spaces sort of feel or sound like, even if you're mocking them up, in your bedroom or in the backyard. Maybe not the concrete part, but like certainly, pieces of leather and pieces of silk, or sort of other kinds of, rope fabrics that you can sort of take and play with. Just one of my, sometimes you have favorite moments in buildings that aren't so good. And one of my favorite moments in Diller Scafidio's Renfro's Alice Tully Hall is, which is a concert hall, is that you go from a large glass atrium, which is quite loud, into a rosewood concert hall, which is a completely tuned instrument. And the way that you make that transition is you go into a hallway, which is ceiling, floor, walls, all thick felt. And the felt basically deadens all sound, right? So you go somewhere that's very, very loud, that's strong, what is it, strong-mannered, to somewhere that's just like dead, like no sound. Like, I wouldn't even say soft-mannered because it's just like, it just falls off. There's no reverberation. And then into a concert hall, which is really like this kind of fine-tuned, delicate sound experience. So, you know, again, the way that the spatial program, the way that you occupy it, what is making the sound, all seems to matter in this point. I say all that, and I also want to commend you. I think the rigorous way that you're approaching this, and the way that you've been really careful to sort of create taxonomies and sort of make those sort of flow from one step to the other, I really appreciate. So I think it's very, it's easy to sort of understand what you're trying to get at, but I think you're still in a little bit in the investigation part in terms of how you're getting there.
Maybe as you were speaking, I was thinking about Soft Schindler as well, the way in which the presence of some of the things that were introduced into the house, like Bryony Roberts pieces and the textile pieces that were placed inside the interior, really changed the way sound would reverberate in that space. And that whole, the role of softening, not only literally as the material treatment, but the acoustic softening as well, might be something to look at. And there is a piece that we did for SCI-Arc Channel on Soft Schindler, so you can watch and maybe telling about it. Also, Amparito, I think that the use of the camera in the animation, I could imagine that the camera maybe is not this sort of neutral observer, but that it kind of keys in a little bit. If you imagine walking through that tunnel, and you might pause and you might turn, you might get close to the wall, to one of those textiles or the rubber, so I imagine that the camera treatment right now, it's very kind of linear and there's a kind of constant speed to it. I would consider, you know, actually kind of corresponding it to the way in which the sounds are working as well. So I think if there are any...
Yes, thank you everybody for the comments. I think, Amp, you have a lot of stuff on your table. I wish you had shown for Marcelyn's comments just now, that small clip that you had of only one room, that you kind of moved towards it. But I think that these are all amazing comments.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. And now we're going to see Jonathan Warner's project. Hi, Jonathan.
Hi. Okay. Let me just set up here. Just while I'm setting everything up. So I'm just gonna give like kind of an introduction to my thesis and then kind of introduce a manifesto just as a kind of way that I'm kind of understanding how I'm working, and then kind of present the project after. So my thesis is titled Masking Agency. And the process of masking has become ubiquitous in architectural representation. We as designers abuse its power, layering a series of unrelated contexts in a single image for the sake of realism. Trees, texture overlays, motion blurred figures, and in this case, an iPhone, are all stereotypical examples of this. In the contemporary discourse, masking is strictly a means to reveal or conceal one or many contexts, physical or virtual, by linking a black, gray, or white value to specific pixel on an image. Defined by what Amy Culver describes as architecture's digital turn, the advent of Photoshop by Thomas Knoll in 1988. It is as simple as that. However, subverting the expectation that masking only exists as a tool of anti-contextual image construction reveals its unrealized potential to generate three-dimensional form, finish, and minute articulation simultaneously only through the construction of masks. So I'm kind of like theorizing and understanding the tool of masking and how architects can use it to make space and architecture. So I'm really trying to engage the tool in a way that's both has to do with form and material, but also the way I'm kind of presenting my project to everybody. So masking feathers the design process into the public realm. So I'm kind of dealing with this low culture of how architects can kind of inject their work into the public realm by masking. In this case, I'm masking my process. The YouTube video is pending, it's coming soon. Masking assumes the initial state of form to be transparent, not white. So really, it's kind of all about perceiving form and architecture through its image rather than what the form is. So I'm kind of denying this blank formal language and rather kind of turning to image and how it starts to construct form itself. Masking recontextualizes image on an inform to reveal spatial characters. This goes back to that same concept. So this is a building in Berlin, and there's just kind of these strange like slippages that start to happen between some parts of architecture where you're kind of wondering like what is the layer that exists behind it. Masking must exist in layers. So really just kind of, it's really about kind of creating space where occupants can occupy this space between layers rather than kind of occupying this overall volume. Masking lacks a distinct contextual truth. This kind of goes back to that slippage as shown in the building in Berlin. Masking can exist between 0 and 1, so it can be totally hidden or totally revealed or somewhere in between. And this is just kind of an exploration of how I'm starting to do that. And I'll just let this play for a minute. And lastly, I'm trying to engage my audience through masking by not necessarily presenting a final product, which has its representations tied to it, but rather presenting a series of content that is all understood as its own kind of body of work, rather than making some kind of form or building and then saying, okay, I'm going to make these images of it. It's rather kind of the opposite. So I have these 3 sites, which I'm kind of defining as places of production. So there's kind of like the independent like artist studio, and then there's the Calabasas mansion, which influencers love to have. And then there's kind of like the large scale warehouse production space. So to relate it specifically to the architectural discourse, my thesis constructs a series of highly elusive, inhabitable, and rearrangeable dioramas based on specific locations in LA, which are there. So architectural samples are actively masked to materialize space that is feathered, cut, blatantly displaced, and lacks a distinct contextual truth. These programmatic spaces are defined by its overlays and erasures, existing as just material, making them perfect for virtual production. Its aesthetics are no mistake. Digital brushstrokes, drop shadows, and bevels consistently remind the viewer of latent layers embedded within its surface. These surfaces are both thick, thin, and occupiable, allowing users to slip between its layers and wedge them in unsettling superpositions. So I'm just going to share the link to my website, and that's it. And you guys can, I invite you guys to like play around with the website and kind of like rearrange the diorama. And there will be 3 of these. I only have 1 right now. And that's it. Thank you.
Jonathan, question. Is there intention about this producing 3-dimensional space? Because masking is, of course, a 2D tool. Mm-hmm. And the way you talk about the space is always in function of layers. So am I to understand? Yes, correct. This is sort of a 2D way of experiencing space.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of like to think of it as like 2.5 dimensional because, I mean, I kind of was working through, originally I was working through a game, which is in here, which you can actually kind of be in between the layers. And there's actually space that lies behind that. And I mean, I feel like I could represent it in a way that illustrates it a little bit more clearly, I think. And really just like how do you kind of represent the space that's between the layers and not necessarily a space that exists within a volume. So yeah, I think there can be a little bit more exploration in that. So yes and no is my answer. So
what you just described sounds to me a lot like stage drops or backdrops and sort of the layering of different drops. Is that something that you're interested in, like seeing these as drop surfaces?
Yeah.
Or because one of the images that you had, it turns a corner and is starting to create three-dimensional space.
Yes, this one here. Yeah, I have to say that the one that I did make, the other two, I'm going to do more of this. Because I kind of, I mean, I made that first diorama a little while ago, and I think I need to kind of refresh the next two to kind of have those corner and spatial conditions that you're talking about that are kind of happening like here.
I guess one of the sort of things I think about a lot when I see projects that are sort of so of a particular moment, right? That this is, you know, really owes a lot to meme culture, as well, you know, as well as kind of the masking tool, right? Like the way that you're talking about it, operating on it, sort of rolling it out on YouTube, is to what degree is the actual, like, does the actual tool need to be represented, right? Like the size and shape of basically that erasure tool, right? And the way that the physical hand moves it. Like, is that the important thing? Because that creates a certain kind of gestural aesthetic, or is it like what we're showing right now, which it's really more of like kind of like the cut and paste sort of moving of things. I'm not quite sure from what you've shown us, like sort of what, like, I think there's a little bit of a fetishization, maybe not even a little, a lot, of the certain kinds of ways that things look when they're produced. But I think what you're really more interested in is actually like kind of the acts of that production rather than kind of the tools, if I'm right about that, like the things that are like, I don't know, that these are thin, that they're transparent, that they're iterative and sort of non-structural, or sort of defy ideas of composition and defy ideas of structure, or you know, of gravity. Things like those seem like the things that you're interested in, rather than that it looks like a kind of a blurred finger stroke. Yeah,
that's correct. Yeah, like maybe it could be a little distracting, possibly the kind of way. I mean, I kind of was thinking about it more because people use it very messily, and that kind of goes back to the like the first image that I showed, where there's like the guy holding the iPhone and you don't see a shadow of it on the shirt. So people use it like uncaringly. I think that maybe I'm trying to say, like, maybe we should be a little more, the funny thing is I'm saying like we should be a little more careful about it, but then I'm kind of using the hand of it as well. So it could be a little contradictory in a way. So I see what you're saying, yeah.
Yeah, it could get a little cute, right? And I think that becomes distracting for what you're actually trying to talk about.
Okay.
I would add to that I would want to challenge the method precisely to find its three-dimensional implications. And of course, you're extrapolating from this process that it's implying that there are layers, you know, and again, a tool of this software, which is masking, has a lot to do with also the order of them as they're placed as layers. So which is behind, which is in front. And that's something that you seem to be also playing with, is like pushing and pulling them back and front. So, you know, if you were to take this that you have and kind of skew it 45 degrees and show us these layers sort of one in back of each other in more of a didactic way than anything else, and how, you know, things are being moved up or back. And so because of the masking, which can also allow you to erase what is in one layer, can be seen in the front or can be pulled visually. I think that's where this begins to get, you know, into the realm of an operation that you can, you know, once you've used this ploy and studied, you know, and understood all of its implications spatially, then to, you know, own that and see in a similar way to what Sixtina was doing, like, how is this ultimately taking you into space? And what comes after that? Like, if you would speculate on the ultimate result of a whole series of operations through these techniques, you can find yourself with something that is uncovering, you know, completely different potential. I wonder too if you might want to make, just for the sake of the thesis argument, correlations with, you know, historical examples of architectures that had been produced through collage, or, you know, that was sort of a big deal when you started to see, you know, pieces cut out and pasted together, and that had implications on the way, you know, certain pieces of architecture were produced, and just to insert yourself in that same tradition or that same methodology, I think could be, you know, could strengthen your thesis.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely stuff that I have. I think I need to put it in. Yeah, for sure. Okay.
So I'm trying to think of something useful to tell you. So like I keep on thinking if since it's an architecture school, the project has to end up being something that lives outside of a computer. And if the answer is not necessarily, then it's also fine. But perhaps it starts to resemble Zepeng wrapping exercise, because I mean every theater curtain is masking. Every wall in a way is also masking. Like it like one of the purposes is that you don't see the other side, and it has social implications, and it has, like, beyond the spatial implications, it might have also social implications. Like it alienates, like it excludes whatever's on the other side. I'm not sure if it will be sort of like an interesting take on this exercise to try to think of masking outside of a Photoshop tool and more of a tool built, a tool used in the real world. Like how does one mask outside of a computer?
Right. Yeah.
Maybe that could be done through the selection of what's being masked, because I'm fascinated by how your world is populated. Like, what are the elements that we find in here? Where do these pieces come from? What are the sources? who are the characters? I mean, when I was clicking around on your website, and then it was fascinating when I realized when I click on them, they get larger and I can zoom in, and then suddenly I discovered this character whose face is all pixels, and we see something that looks like a digital model of a human body with clothing and a kind of character, but it's like a model of something. And so the idea of, you know, how do you build this world? And this is kind of almost like a kit of parts or things or beings, occupants in this world. And I wonder if it might be, to pick up on what Javier is saying, that maybe you work on something that is in the real world that you reimagine, utterly reimagine, so that this, I mean, all these sources come from somewhere, and maybe they're pulled, you know, from online, but maybe even pulling from something you know very well, or some, you know, a neighborhood somewhere in Los Angeles or in some other city that you can imagine, like, what would this world look like if we masked and reimagine and reinvent? But it's fascinating. I mean, the website is really, I think, quite an amazing tool.
I just dropped a few things, just sort of based on Elisa's comment about, you know, sort of references. One's Gary Panter's design for Pee-wee's Playhouse set. So that idea of the thinness and the rearranging of different pieces. The other is Charles Moore's Piazza d'Italia in New Orleans. And then lastly, the Palladio's Teatro Olimpico. And I'm thinking about all of these both because they're working through collage, which in a way you're the kind of anti-collage, but it's still kind of collage. And also through sightlines and sort of visuality around what, you know, how the different layers build up to produce whatever effect that it's trying to do. So just as a kind of point that the kind of, there's a kind of a long trajectory of a kind of playing with the thinness and the kind of obscuring or revealing within the kind of theatrics of architecture that I think you can start to kind of claim space within, even if you're working within a digital environment.
Okay, thank you. I'll definitely look at that.
Thank
Jonathan, I think that these are all great comments. Thank you, everybody. I just wanted to make one note. I agree with the comment on both. I think everybody, both all said how you move from the Photoshop to real life. You know, I think that's when you make it into a thesis, from an idea into a thesis project. And I was thinking maybe as an option, like your tutorial could be something live, like Marcelyn said, almost as if you had a green screen and the Photoshop was in 3D. Elisa was talking about what if you shift, you're in elevation, but you need to shift a bit. So you see the layers, and then the fact that Photoshop has so many layers. Anyway, we can continue talking, but I think that's a really important point of how you take this to the next level.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Jonathan. So next we will see Joy Dai's project. Hi, Joy.
Hi, thank you. All right, let me share my screen. Can everyone see my screen? Okay.
Yes.
All right. The title of my project is Architectural Recipes, a need for delight in the post-pandemic city. So my thesis is an aesthetic investigation of architecture through confectionery delight and the art of plating. I'll get back to this recipe in a bit, but for now, I'll introduce a few references. So I'm sure all of you are familiar with the game Candyland. This was a 1940s children's board game that was created during the polio pandemic. Candyland offered an antidote and gave immobilized patients a liberating fantasy of movement. And here, these collection of, only 3 are shown here, but there's a total of 19 cheeky drawings by Andy Warhol and Susie Frankfurt, and they're put together in a cookbook. They are recipes that feature intentional misspellings and their attempt to tease serious cooks who follow these pretentious and popular French cookbooks of the time. And this is in 2012, the world-renowned pastry chef Pierre Hermé gave a talk at the GSD. He brought 5 chefs, 2 assistants, 600 sheets of gelatin, 150 eggs, 68 pounds of sugar, 40 pounds of butter, 32 pounds of cream, and much more. This event was called The Architecture of Taste, and it recaptures this night and the psychological effects of Hermé's pastry visions. And this quote by Hermé, there is no final destination in the journey of creation. He muses, the field of pastry is an inexhaustible one. The only limits are yourself and your imagination. So driven by aesthetics in the process of confection making, the mission of my project is to draw on the culinary arts to design architecture, both working in modes of taste, experience, materiality, and consumption. I use this very idea as a departure point with how I proceed with various material experimentations from my own kitchen during quarantine. So here are just a few sketches and gestural drawings of my miniature model. And for miniatures, actually quite a few weeks back now, I used several methods of mixing and form making with just only one ingredient, which is sugar. And it turned out to be a sugar shaping experiment and layering material composed in a so-called landscape. And moving on into the midterm today, I was additionally driven by our culture's obsession with food photography and how it is displayed. So shown here are some unassembled ingredients. For my midterm model, I assembled these ingredients and put it on display for visual consumption. There was no actual real consumption, so since it was just made for the photography. And then I proceeded to cut a section and put it on a plate. I gave the photographer several instructions specifically to capture my model in the classic top-down, also known as the ultimate Instagram angle. The flat lay is perfect for capturing a table scene or a sense of community sharing a meal. And using the art of plating in confections, I use these aesthetics as basis for my thesis. My project uses plating as a partie. So here is the midterm drawing that I did with various elements. And okay, so back to the recipe that I showed earlier. It has several ingredients, 5 parts and pieces, and simple directions for composition. So the location of my project is actually in the middle of downtown Los Angeles. It's Angels Knoll. It's surrounded by high-rise buildings and also various parking lots that I've diagrammed. The site itself, it serves as the intersection of converging neighborhoods, the financial district, the historical core, the civic center, and the cultural district, which are my ingredients. And this location is a monumental landmark in the urban landscape. This monumental landmark is, so I'm proposing a playground and urban park on this very hill, which is a monumental move. I'm arguing for a view of the new a new ground. The ground is a rotating slab, a plate, a slow spinning playground with changing views of downtown. So the views are more apparent at the eye level of the pedestrian looking out into the city. This urban park on the hilltop of Los Angeles argues for this new view. Today, the park is a depressing shell of its former self as it remains fenced in and closed to the public. So these photographs that I found were actually from back in 2012 when the park was open. So as I move towards the final presentation, I will be putting together 5 video clips that will embody an imaginary and transformed Angel's Knoll through cinematic effect to capture atmosphere, vibrant and playful cinemagraphs composed of the 5 connection parts in my recipe, which are landscape, elevator and stairs to California Plaza, underground subway escalator, a playground, and Angel's Flight funicular. Here are some rudimentary placement shots of my project on the site. These clips will be developed from moving footage and projected photographic stills in 2.5D using a technique called matte painting. And driven by the idea of display culture and culinary arts, these spaces showcase the need for delight in the post-pandemic city and to elevate the sense of playfulness in community, especially from the isolation we've all faced in the past several months. Okay, so I'll just leave it at this grid view of my presentation.
Joy, can you talk a little bit more about, I don't know which number slide this is, but where you've reintroduced your studies back into the site. I guess it's the slide that's black and white with the blue and purple on it.
Oh.
That forward?
That one. Okay, yeah, so basically I'm taking the aesthetic moves quite literally here. I'm actually creating a landscape full of the moves that I've discovered with the active mixing and putting them into the site. And so these are just kind of like rudimentary stills that I've put together for the purpose of illustration.
So you're keeping everything that already exists on the site. This would be something superimposed on the staircases, the trees, the landscape as it exists.
Yeah, so I will be intervening into the landscape, but yes, correct. Those things that do exist will be wrapped with an aesthetic move that I've made.
So this rests above, and is it habitable, or is it more some like a new surface that you use on all of its exterior space, or is there an interior?
So it is an exterior surface, and it will be flat and facing the city. So there's no sort of interior. Well, as you see here, you're moving from the underground into the exterior, but the rest of the project is exterior.
I don't understand. Like I was with you through the kind of investigation of food photography and the use of different ways of sort of representing food and even the use of food as a material. But I'm a little at a loss as to like even spatially what this is. Like, is this a vinyl wrap on top of the existing architecture? When you said it's standing up and facing the city, like, is this a billboard that's actually it behind 2 blocks away and we're looking and seeing it through the glass? Like I've kind of lost, I've lost sense of space and materials here entirely. Mm-hmm. And I say that because I was really with you in your argumentation, and this is where it went a little sideways for me.
Okay, so let me just go back a little bit. And so I think where it's not fully represented and argued are the last few slides here, where I actually try to implement the project onto the site. And so that is something that I'm actually currently working with, which no, they're not supposed to look like vinyl wraps onto just like a surface, but rather they exist as separate objects that wrap around, not just like flat, but in three-dimensional space. And so that is just something, I guess, the representation wise, like these, I guess, collages might not look as convincing as like I tried to describe it as, but that is currently work in progress.
Joy, when did the site selection happen? Is that very recent, or have you been thinking about this place all along?
So I've had the site from the very beginning. And so, because I've always just kind of thought about the uses of community spaces, and even like very early on, like the population of so many parking lots in the city, and how can a parking lot, you know, like if they're possibly, if this could even be turned into a parking lot. But I think just kind of turning it into a space where community can converge and use it as sort of, you know, viewing the city and using like my argument for the aesthetic, I think is more where I'm trying to get at.
Just wanted to clarify Joy started with Aldo Van Eyck and the use of you know, kind of abandoned public spaces. I think he made up to 200 small plazas for children. So I think that that's the program, and that's why the site. She didn't attempt, these renders come from a more literal plating of a cake in the site. So I think that Joy, I think any feedback on how we take all that amazing process into the final project, I think will be all welcome. But just wanted to clarify why this is a public space. It comes from her aim at going back to kind of Candyland and so on.
Yeah, exactly. So this is sort of Candyland, not in the polio moment, but now in the COVID moment, presented in a highly accessible location. I think you might want to, for, you know, the sake of your audience, build on that more, like the selection of the site and the intentions you have for it. What I take from the metaphor of the art of plating, I think, you know, you've presented the angles for taking photographs, like the plan view from some aerial perspective, or you know, that cake that you made. I have no idea how you get, what do you call it, filling to be vertical. I've only seen cakes done with horizontal, but that seems, you know, like the demonstration of a true, you know, sort of artist making pastries or cakes. And that's why you need the section of it to show that off. So there's another kind of, you know, spatial or architectural ploy there. So you have the angles from which it's seen, and you do have, I think, an opportunity to literally or figuratively slice into this landscape. And the fact that this place that you've chosen has such a difficult topography already, I mean, I think is something you need to play into and not just sort of obliterate it with this, you know, nicely flat plate that you're placing on top of it. And, you know, all the sectional interest that it probably has, it could be, you know, corollary with the filling and the cake and all the crazy stuff that must have happened before it got its icing on it. And because I mean, otherwise you're to simply place this on top is too superficial of a operation to take from the research you've done. I think it does need to have the equivalent of a slice that you've understood, whether it's existing and you've incorporated that. So like, I would love to see how this might fuse in a section with those staircases that you showed in the image, and where the art of bringing new matter on top of it is both making it inviting, making it whimsical, making it specific for children, and frankly, I don't know if it's going to look like a cake in the end. It probably isn't. You still have your Candyland ploy at the beginning of your presentation to explain that this is a free promenade of some sort. You're presenting here a dimension for movement, ostensibly for and for play. So are these things that you want to recognize, for example, from the buildings that are surrounding it, that do have height, that would see this from that kind of a perspective, and the joy that might come from that relationship, even if you're not participating in it, but you're visually enjoying it, the way another thing that you could take from plating. It's the weirdest thing in the world to think of food as being subject of imagery, but no, we're quite used to it now, like that, of course, even though you don't sense it that way, or you don't ingest it literally that way. So talking about the dimensions in which this is going to operate visually from its surroundings, and then also functionally preserving the functions that already exist there, but bringing in, this activity geared for children or adult children who play there as well. All of that is frankly like where this, I think, needs to go.
I think, Joy, also the confection, because I had many of the same questions that are coming up about whether it necessarily needs to look like the cake at the end. And I was struck by the image where you showed the deconstructed cake, and it looked like pieces of that were things that were kind of layers, but then there was an egg. It's not really a literal, some of it is sugar that looks like it's arranged like confectioner's sugar. So these are the ingredients, but then I thought, so what are the ingredients of like coming from that site? So maybe parts of this are sort of extracts, like what would be the idea of a confectionized landscape, or the trees that are there, the kind of earth, so if you did a similar operation where you looked at what those constituents are and then how they get reimagined. The word confection to me always suggests something that gets like dreamed up in a really, it's sort of like a thing we would never have thought of, but it's a confection of the mind that we imagine. And so I love the idea that you want to reimagine the site and make something that can be seen from above, and that is this public space and a playground, and really, introducing that activity as, specifically for play. And I think that's all fantastic. I think it's just a question of, the source material might come from a variety of sources. It might not only be from the cake, but you might be confectionizing, the place itself, like the trees on the site, and so other things might come into this cakiness.
So Joy, I'm going to make a quick comment to you because I know your time's out. But I think what impressed me the most of your presentation was what you can build with sugar, like the many ways that you've achieved forms with sugar. And I think that was a few slides before. But yeah, those are fantastic. So I don't know how big these can go. Like, can they be bench size? And if you're thinking of something ephemeral, like how do you, like Aldo Van Eyck does very permanent things with parks. But thinking about like the first day that the pandemic is over, like something could be crafted with sugar and just like melt away with the first rain. Like symbolically, it could be very strong. And since you obviously know how to handle sugar, I mean, testing how big you can make it, I think could also be sort of like an interesting way of like how many 23-year-old girls could make could assemble a park that lasts 2 days made out of sugar.
Thank you, everyone, for the comments. They were really helpful, and I think I know where to go from here.
Okay. Yeah, I just along that, I want to say that the kind of attention to the research that you've done up until you hit the site is really good. And I think you need to put that same attention into the site. So make some drawings or other kinds of operations on the site, not just working through photography, but I think there's definitely room to work through model, maybe sugar model, and drawing at the site level.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joy.
Thank you all. I think these are great comments. I think we have a lot of notes, Joy.
And so now we have our final project by Sherry Cow.
Hi, everyone. Am I share the screen? My thesis topic is the botanic imprint, the rewildness of architecture, which is focusing on the synthesis between rewilding botanic species and engraving and embossing to make a mark on the body of architecture. Here I treat plants as a philosophical being. The role of the architect is to design the rewilding process. In order to achieve specific futuristic rewildness effects, work more like a landscape architect. One could imagine the scenario that rewilding is going to take place, and the architect ought now to design the botanic imprint on part of architecture details. The botanic imprint as a phenomenal imaginary of utopian world allows the rest of human-made infrastructure to be imprinted by nature. Here above are the concept collages I made during the thesis prep. By continuing doing the research on the concept of botanic imprint and rewildness of architecture, I was amazed by the Giovanni Piranesi's drawing and how enchanted and detailed the room and background atmosphere he created, and recorded the delicacy of the rewildness of architecture elements. The World Expo inside the Crystal Palace was a centralized collection showing the power of the colonization. The Crystal Palace is similarly like a terrarium that brings the beautiful things together. Also, the Winter Garden inside the small hermitage brought the same idea of preserving the natural beauty. Here at the Java Center in New York as an initial site of the concept miniature model. The reason why I choose the New York as the city is the most urbanized and willing to have an escape from the post-industrialized urban state to embrace the natural imprint. There are also interior concept assemblation for the botanic imprint for Java Center. I'm trying to embracing the natural imprint without owning it. Here nature is beyond. That I'm trying to document it and treat it as a gateway place that let rewildness happens in the city. And here, I would like to create a state of architecture becoming cohabitable for pet plants. This is the miniature concept model for the project because currently I'm out of the country and due to the limitation of making the physical model, I customized and enriched the succulents and choose the glass terrarium, which is 40-inch tall. The miniature model would like to depict the idea of how plants cohabited and imprinted inside the glass terrarium like architecture. When continuing doing the research, the method of botanic imprint on architecture are a good idea of renovation, the abandoned and industrial infrastructure. As we could see from the Burn and Hill species collection and these infrastructures, here I choose a steel structure industrial warehouse and start to renovate it and design the botanic and landscape inside a warehouse. It could be function as the 3 levels natural embrace gallery and leisure spaces, or an indoor oxygen zone to insert natural imprint into the abandoned industrial infrastructure. It's a 3D and cubic interpretation from the collages I made at the beginning. I brought potential vivifying effect around the post-industrial district. Yeah, thank you.
So are you creating a greenhouse?
Yeah, a greenhouse, like a botanic imprinted, like renovated industrial infrastructure.
Like the High Line. Only.
Yeah. Also, maybe an idea from the MVRDV Expo, like in 2000 in Holland.
I mean, I understand the troubles. This has a site, though. Did I?
This is right now. It's a siteless.
It's siteless, and you're not imagining it in a specific way, like. That's why you're showing the Becker's
yes.
documentation as something like ubiquitous.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, for what it's worth, there's a tendency of trying to find ways to produce farming, at a more viable scale in vertically. So buildings that are climate controlled, and I can share one in it's in Maine, Portland, Maine. That is it's a beautiful project, just not so much aesthetically, but it has a very sophisticated, high-tech way of producing organic vegetables, lettuce, and so forth. The interesting thing about it is that it employs people that are of some sort of learning disability. And so it joins these two, not that you have to, take that on, but just understanding the architecture of it is fascinating, I think, because it doesn't respond to, superimposed plans anymore. It really has a completely different logic, and belts move the produce around vertically and ostensibly, I suppose, expose it to sun in different ways. It might be something you could look into, but my thought on that, though, is that it's a very kind of specific program with a specific agenda, and I'm, wondering where is the kind of research thesis exploration that you're trying to get at, because yes, the Piranesi drawings of ruinous Roman buildings have this, obviously, was of this time, this romantic characteristic to it. But then when we see the collages that you're producing, they are not something that you're rescuing as happening in a natural way, or they are very imposed. They're your own. It's very manicured. It's very artificial. Maybe that's the word too. Like none of that could happen in a romantic, ruinous sort of condition. It's brought in a very artificial way. So that's where I don't know if either you actually embrace this artificial way of producing vegetation, like even without soil necessarily, which is the example that I'm showing you.
Yeah.
those things only happen in the tropics. Like in Caracas, all of the stuff that you're showing really does happen because there's so much rain but normally this doesn't happen, right? So, but yet I find, you know, if you wanted to embrace like how could this actually happen? Because, you know, technology has, and the footprint of urban territory and its density has pushed economically a paradigm where now it is interesting to produce vegetation, to produce agriculture in a compact, controlled setting within an urban environment. And that's where I think maybe the site selection could, or the conditions of that site selection could inform where you go with such an artificial way of producing, you know, vegetation within architecture.
Yeah.
I guess what I'm trying, so all of that to get down to the nugget is like, what is the premise that makes this happen other than your own will to kind of embellish these images with vegetation?
Yeah, I will think about this question and continue like solving this problem.
So Sherry, I think when you say problem, I'm not sure if you really have a problem in mind. Like this doesn't seem like a quest, you know, for well or a message even, you know. It's like, so Piranesi, it's like the sketchings are of a lost empire that has been like overgrown with plants. At that time, you weren't supposed to see the plants as something beautiful. You were supposed to see like the abandoned ruins. When I started seeing your presentation and think about the Javits Center, which could potentially be a greenhouse. I mean, not if you leave it by itself, but because of the glass, it wouldn't be hard to convert it into some fashion of a crystal palace. But
yeah,
is it like a political statement of bring convention centers down and turn them into like botanical gardens? And is it more like seeing what of the existing repertoires of buildings around you, or that symbolize something that you don't agree with, are suitable for hosting like plants, like another kind of life inside of them? And then you sort of have like a political statement, like returning something to nature or to society, you know, like some fashion of a park. But then I don't know if you're talking about NT factories or if you have one in mind.
yeah. I think when I saw the collection of the Vernon Hills collection, and I think about the city in my home country, there are a lot of abandoned warehouse or like industrial places. Maybe hasn't been torn down, but and maybe because some issues that it have, so it hasn't been like torn down or changed to a new district, or like city of the city like close to the New York, but it's a post-industrial city. Sorry, I can't.
There's a bunch of them.
Yeah, and seems like the city remains like that. So maybe this like green, like botanic imprint and insertion to these buildings, it might be a campaign that brings like nature and neighborhood, like let the neighborhood more vivifying. Maybe like yes, that's what I'm thinking about maybe when I'm doing this 3D like collage inside there's this warehouse.
I guess, so for me, this comes to like questions of like nature and like what does nature do? Like, and why do we even call it nature or call it landscape? Or what happens when we think of it more as an ecology or habitat, right? Or even something unnatural like a greenhouse where, right now there's a big demand for warehouses in California in order to grow cannabis, right? Like that's, something completely unnatural. And so I'm not hearing a really strong position around sort of what does plant material do in your point, or what you want it to do. There's a bit of a sort of conversation about, oh, this is going to make something better. But to like Javier's point of like the Piranesi, like the plant material there was meant to sort of suggest ruin, right? That something had gone quite literally to seed. But I think and then like the development of the High Line, it kind of comes out of questions of rewilding, right? And then how does something that has been sort of taken back by nature then become a very highly curated public-private partnership that sort of facilitates the investment of capital on New York's, sort of High Line, right? So in the way that you begin to talk about like nature specifically, right? In terms of the kinds of habitat plants, like how they got there, like all of that is really important because it shapes sort of your overall position about what the architecture is doing and what it needs to do. Like, this isn't like the ice cream museum of landscape, right? So this isn't meant to be like a fake park that you go to, like you go to the mall, or is it?
Yeah.
I think that these are great questions, Sherry, and I would say I would bring them down to 2 points. One is what Elisa was saying about nature as agriculture, and the program that she sent, that link, I think is great. I have collected all the links, so you guys, I'm going to send it to you. But so nature, what is the new role of agriculture? I think to Mimi's point, the idea of like pot growing in the middle of downtown LA might be one of those. Is that agriculture? I mean, I don't know. Is that real? I don't know. The second question has to do also with both the point that Javier and Mimi made on regard to what is nature. Like, Piranesi's plants are not welcomed. These are the plants that, what is the park? I think that Javier was saying, would you convert? And also convention center is where supposedly all of the political arenas were going to happen, like if you convert them all to landscape projects or parks. So that would be one, or rewilding, what Mimi was talking about the High Line. I think you have to choose which one is your park. You don't want to do the ice cream museum of nature, definitely. This is not about featuring, it's not about a greenhouse like in a museum. I think this is about your take on nature on regard to either public space or agriculture. So you would choose one of those. It seems that it's more about public space because it's landscaping in your example. So I think you either, I would say you go with Elisa's site, literally, and program, or you really take over the Chavez Center and convert it. And then as an exercise, I'm going to take these really massive sites and programs and then just create a nature in them.
Yeah.
And I think, Sherry, also considering what the plant species are, once I think someone mentioned an old steel mill near Pittsburgh. in Pennsylvania that was being remediated with sunflowers. And I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but I thought that was just an amazing idea that that species of plant would actually be able to remediate the soil. And so not only does it change the whole kind of visual presence of those sites, but it's kind of doing work as well. So it's like a productive garden in a sense.
Yeah.
So I think that would be really important to look into.
Yeah, thank you.
I think if there are no other comments.
I would like to, as Marcelyn closes the review, I'd like to thank our critics. I mean, midterm review is really, is to do what you guys did, the three of you, which is just challenge what at stake, challenge the thesis. It's not about, what's happening here, redesigning it, but really challenging, what you guys are saying, what are you doing? You have 1 month. It seems that it's only 1 month. The last month is always huge. So this last month is huge. It's where projects do happen. So I think that I'm really thankful that you guys challenge each student to just say what exactly you're doing, how you're doing, and make sure that your project presents your research. So I think that I just wanted to thank you guys for that.
Thank you so much, everyone. I think we all have some really valuable comments and references, and it was wonderful to meet those of you that I didn't know before. And I want to thank all the students who did a great job at presenting today, and really a lot of provocative questions and issues on the table, and really look forward to seeing the finals. And it's wonderful to see all the dogs joining.
Mine was